Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Divine Liturgy course. Today, my friends, we will be talking about what happens in the Divine Liturgy right after the celebrating clergy enter back into the sanctuary at the little entrance. This, I will remind you, is the transitional moment that completes the beginning part called the Enarxis of the Divine Liturgy, which I have called gathering and warm-up, and takes us into the next part, which I have called entrance into the sacrament of the Word. Now, after that warm-up part, we have hopefully gathered our thoughts and are ready to focus and really pay attention to the readings from the New Testament that are soon solemnly to be read, to be celebrated really, in the midst of our gathering. So, what happens now is the priest and deacon, if there is a deacon, enter the sanctuary, and if there's a deacon, he hands the gospel book, which he carried in the little entrance procession, to the priest, and the priest places it back on the altar table. Now, if the bishop is celebrating, after he enters the sanctuary, he does an incensation of the altar table, the iconostasis, and people, and in many churches, the priest also does this incensation when there's no bishop celebrating. But you know, in the Russian Orthodox Church, we only have this particular incensation if a bishop is celebrating. It is, in fact, of a rather late origin. It first appears in the early second millennium, as do many things, and it was done at first by the deacon. But we won't get into that in further detail in this video. At a bishop's liturgy at this point, as the bishop does this incensation, the choir sings an acclamation to the bishop, which all of you have probably heard, Is pola eti despota, which means many years master. Now we're welcoming the bishop because really it is only at this point, you see, that he properly joins the other lesser celebrants. Note that up to this point, he's been sitting back there in the nave, and this is a remnant of an earlier form of the Divine Liturgy, which, as I mentioned in previous videos, please do watch our previous videos leading up to this one, it did not have the whole beginning part, our Divine Liturgy. It didn't have this Enarxis, this beginning part that we've been talking about thus far. And the bishop entered originally with the people and began the liturgy from this very point, the point at which we now have the so-called little entrance, just before the readings. You see, the hierarchical or bishop's liturgy retains more ancient forms because, why? Because it is celebrated more rarely. Okay, that is an important point that needs to be made here about liturgical development in general. It's one of the so-called laws of liturgical development, which liturgical scholars have observed and developed. Our more solemn and rarely celebrated rites, like the rite of liturgy celebrated by a bishop, or also like the extra solemn liturgical times of year, like Great Week and Pascha, these more rarely celebrated forms do retain more ancient forms of liturgy. Why is this so? Because those services that we celebrate less, we tend to change less. And this makes sense if you think about it. We don't tinker so much with the rites, we practice more rarely. Anyway, after this entrance, the little entrance, we sing a series of hymns called Troparia and Kontakia, and I'll get to the meaning of these terms at the end of this video. Anyway, we sing a series of these, mostly in honor of the feasts, or saints, or other commemorations of the day. But we also sing Troparia in honor of the church, the building in which we have gathered, that is the patron saint of our parish church, in honor of whom, or sometimes it's a feast, the church was consecrated. So this is, and we'll get to the meaning of that You see, because a lot of the parts here at the beginning of the Divine Liturgy, if you've been paying attention, thematize the church building itself in order to help us to be cognizant, to be aware of where we have gathered, and this very liturgical space helps us to get into the mood, the proper atmosphere and mood of prayer. Okay? Now, this is a changeable part of the Divine Liturgy, which changes depending on the liturgical calendar and on the church in which any given liturgy is being celebrated. And as I've told you before, here we have another liturgical law that has been observed by liturgical scholars. Whatever is changeable in Byzantine liturgy is usually a later development. And so it is with these hymns, the Troparia and Kontakia, which begin to be inserted into this moment of the Divine Liturgy in the early second millennium. As I've already said, like a lot of things were appearing at this time, and we also have more manuscripts that testify to developments at this time. So a whole series of Troparia and Kontakia, not immediately a lot of them, but these appear as an extension of the entrance verse. Now, there was an entrance verse of some sort that we know of already at earlier times, but this entrance verse changed throughout the centuries. It was at one point, like in the 6th century, the Trisagion hymn, but at other times it was something else. So the dust didn't settle for many centuries on this whole part of the liturgy. And note that our usual entrance verse, which comes from Psalm 94, verse 6, "Come, let us bow down and worship Devte proskinisomen," it is modified according to the feast or saint of the day. For example, on a Sunday, we sing "Son of God, risen from the dead," and on a weekday, on a non-festal weekday, we sing "Son of God, wonderful in the saints," and so on. But let me get to my point about the Troparia and Kontakia of the day. They are an extension, as I've already said, or multiplication, really, of the entrance verse. Now, we might ask ourselves, what is the point of an entrance verse extended with a whole string of additional Troparia? It is twofold, my friends. First, to pause our attention on the action of entrance itself, the entrance into a holy place of God and before the presence of God, before whom we bow down and worship as we sing. By the way, I did talk more about the entrance verse in connection with the 3 antiphons at the beginning of liturgy, so check out those videos if you haven't seen them. And the second point of this part, right after the little entrance, is to draw our attention and thoughts to the main theme or themes of our celebration on the given liturgical day. Today, when many people do not attend the preceding services of Vespers and Matins, which contain most of the prayers and hymnography dedicated to the feast or saint of the day, we can all get the main themes of the liturgical day in a nutshell, so to say, by singing attentively these central hymns of the day, called, in fancy Byzantine terms, Troparia and Kontakia. They are usually brief compositions which establish what a given feast or saint is about. The word Troparian, I'll finally get to the meaning of the word, in case you've been wondering, is a diminutive of the Greek word tropos, which in musical terms means a refrain, really, something that is repeated. You see, originally, these brief compositions were sung by the people as refrains in between psalm verses in various liturgical contexts, for example, in processions. Troparia were easily memorizable, just like refrains at the end of certain psalm verses, and we talked about that as well in our videos about the antiphons. So, Troparia were easily memorizable, especially because they were short, so they were sung by heart by the people who did not have liturgical books, while professional cantors leading the singing by chanting the longer parts like entire psalms did that in between. In our modern day usage, it is difficult really to recognize this original purpose of Troparia. But I can tell you one thing, my friends. If you are interested in being more prepared for liturgy, or perhaps to teach your children how better to understand and participate in liturgy, I think a very good place to start is learning certain Troparia by heart, of the great feasts, of your parish church, of the 8 Sundays of the Octohijos, and so on. Then you can sing along in church, but please be considerate when you do this, especially if you have no musical ear. And if you're not sure whether or not you have a musical ear, just ask someone who does, and please take their word for it. I really hate to say this, but it can be painful, really, for someone with a musical ear if the entire liturgy somebody is humming along. At least in the system of Russian singing, it's painful. So just be careful. Anyway, the other hymns we hear at this point are called Kontakia, as I've mentioned, and in Byzantine hymnography, just as there is a main troparion of any liturgical commemoration, feast, saint, and so on, so is there a Kontakion. They're like a pair. There's always a troparion and a Kontakion. Now the hymn called a Kontakion, Kontakion, has a complicated history, but it takes its name originally from the Greek word kontax, which is the rod or stick around which an ancient scroll was wound. Okay, and the ancient poetic compositions called Kontakia, which were initially very long, now we have just sort of a tip of the iceberg there. So these ancient poetic compositions were initially written down and chanted from such scrolls. Now at Divine Liturgy, we first chant all the relevant Troparia of the day in a certain order. There's a certain hierarchy of Troparia, there's a certain logic to it, but these videos are not meant to teach us the rubrics. There are handbooks, and there's the typicon for these rules. Okay, that's a special book which describes the order of these things. It's quite complicated. So first, all the Troparia of the day are chanted, sung, and then all the respective Kontakia. And at the end comes glory and now and ever. And that's then, yes, then a final Kontakion is sung. It always has to be something important. The first and the last are always important, okay? So at the end, we usually have one in honor of the Mother of God, but on the feast of the Lord, we will have one in honor of the feast of the Lord. Okay, so like I said, I won't be explaining the nuances and niceties of the typicon, but don't get me wrong, I do enjoy the intricacies of the typicon, okay? But it's not the purpose of these videos. What is the purpose of our videos, my friends? It's better to participate, okay, so that we know what's going on. And I hope this video does suffice to encourage us to pay attention to these hymns after the little entrance, perhaps even to look them up ahead of time. You can just Google these things and find them easily, so we can be fully present to what is going on any given day that we find ourselves at a divine liturgy, so that we can be on the same page, so to say, as the church, in the same moment or day as the church, because the Troparia tell us why on this particular day we have gathered to celebrate the Eucharist. So that's it for today, my friends, and I will see you next time.